Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our iOS development using UIKit series by talking about UI labels. So we're actually now going to be going into talking about some of the various views in UIKit that you can use in your app, and starting with the most basic one possible, and that being UI labels. So what is a UI label? Well, a UI label is just plain text on the screen. That's all it is. So you can do many things with a UI label, such as changing its text content, applying shadows, having it, changing its font size, all kinds of stuff. We're going to cover a few of those things in upcoming videos, but for now, I'm just going to show you how you can use a UI label in your app. Just kind of put it on the screen, constrain it, do all that. So let's get started. When you go into your Xcode, open viewcontroller.swift, and inside of our class here, at the top of our file, we're going to create a variable, and we're going to call it HWLabel. And we're going to set it equal to an instance of UILabel. Leave the initializer empty. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a separate method for configuring our label, and then a separate method for configuring the label's constraints. And then we're going to create a method for that called configure UI that just calls the other two methods. Right? So if we say func configure UI, we can say configure label and then configure label constraints, like so. We can say func configure label. Here we can customize some of the properties of our label. And we're going to have two specific properties in here. Okay. So the first property is we're going to set the text of our label. So we can say hwlabel.text. So the text property is a string that allows us to get and set the text of our label. And we'll say hello world, like that. Okay. Next, we're going to set a property that is a relatively long one. And this property is called translates auto-resizing mask into constraints, or TAMIC. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is a Boolean property, and if we set it to true, the system tries to create constraints on its own, which we don't want. We want to set it to false, which that will allow us to define the constraints ourselves. All right, so here we can say hwlabel.translates auto-resizing mask into constraints. equals false. Like so. Okay. Now, the final method that we need is func configure constraints, or configure label constraints. All right. Inside of this method, we're going to say ns layout constraint dot activate okay. Here we're going to have an array of our constraints. Okay, and then in here we're going to define our anchors and our constraints. So HWLabel dot, let's say the leading anchor, and then dot constraint. You can see there's many versions of our constraint method here, but the one that we want is equal to and constant here. So equal to. So what anchor do we want to pin the leading anchor of our label to? Well, we want to pin this to the leading edge of our screen. So view dot leading anchor, comma, and then constant. So how much spacing do we want between the two anchors? We're going to say 20. So 20 units. Here we're going to say HWLabel dot top anchor dot constraint equal to, and now what do we want this pinned to? Well, this is where things get a little bit tricky. So the view for our view controller technically extends into the status bar area, where the notch is on the newer iPhones. We don't want to constrain it to the very, very top of our screen where it's like constrained underneath the notch. Otherwise, our label is going to overlap with our, with the time up there in the top corner. So what we want is to pin our label to the top anchor of the safe area. The safe area is everything from just below the notch on the iPhones, right? On the newer iPhones that have a notch, to just above the home indicator at the very bottom of the newer iPhones. If you are on, say, if you're on an iPhone for whatever reason that doesn't have a notch, the safe area is, the very bottom of the screen on the phones that have a physical home button, all the way up to just below the status bar, which is like the time, the battery, stuff like that. Just below that. So that's so that's kind of the safe area. And how do we pin this to the safe area? Well, we can say view dot safe area. We want we want safe area layout guide dot top anchor. So now our UI label is going to be pinned to the top anchor of our safe area, comma, constant, and we want 20 units in between these two anchors. All right. So now we have our X and Y coordinates for the view. But remember how I mentioned in the programmatic UI versus storyboards video that each view needs an X and Y position, and it needs a width and a height. Right? So how then do we give this a width and a height? Well, we have specific anchors for that. We have a width anchor and a height anchor. If we wanted to, we could also pin the trailing anchor of the label to the other side of the screen, the trailing anchor of the view itself, for the screen, and then we would have our width. But I don't want that for now. Right? What I want is the width and height to be hard-coded. Now, for the most part, this isn't something you're going to want to do, but I just want to show you exactly what this looks like. We will change it. We will change the width anchor to a trailing anchor and do it that way towards the end of the video. But again, I want to demonstrate to you the different ways that we can define the constraints on a view for learning purposes. All right. So go ahead and say UILabel dot width anchor dot constraint, and then the one we want is equal to constant. This is a single parameter version of our constraint method on the anchor, and this will basically say, hey, this view needs to be this number of units wide. So equal to constant. And this is going to be, let's say 400 units. Or even better, just to make sure that we're safe, 350 units. So now this label is going to be 350 units long. All right, 350 units wide. Then we can say HW anchor, or not anchor, HW label dot height anchor dot constraint equal to constant 44. Now, why did I choose 44 here? Well, the reason why I chose 44 is because according to the human interface guidelines outlined by Apple, 44 units is the smallest height any view should be that may or may not be tappable. Of course, for example, something like a progress view might not do, the bar itself might not conform to that, obviously, because those are relatively thin. But generally speaking, for something like a label or a button or a text field, they should be at minimum 44 units. That's according to the guidelines for designing an iOS app. So that's why I chose 44 units. And now we have our width, height, X, and Y for our view. But we're not done. we have a few things that we still need to do. And the main thing is we need to go back into Configure UI and then after Configure UI, or Configure Label rather, we need to say view.add subview, and we need to pass this HWLabel. So before you apply constraints, you have to add your whatever view it is as a subview, because if you don't, it's not going to appear on screen and your app may or may not crash. Finally, the last thing we need to do is, let's see, inside of view did load, we're going to say configure UI. And there we go. Let's go ahead and run our code. Okay, build failed. Let's see what we did wrong here. Okay, there we go. I must have spelled it wrong. Okay, there we go. Now, when we run it, we get hello world on our screen in a label just below the notch, about 20 units below it. Or rather 20 units below the notch and 20 units away from the edge of our phone. And that's great and all, but we can't see the bounds of our label, so we can't confirm as of yet the width of our label. And we can do this by going into our configure label method. Let's see here. Okay. Let's go ahead and go after our text here. We can say HWLabel dot background color equals, and this is what's called a UI color. So a UI color is basically just an object in UIKit that defines a color, right? As the name suggests. There are many different colors, but we want, in this example, I'm going to say dot system blue. So this will adapt to light and dark mode beautifully. And then we're going to say HWLabel.textColor. We're going to set that to dot white. Okay. So now the text color will be white and the background color will be blue. So go ahead and save it and run the code again. And now in the simulator, we can see a 44 unit tall label and its width is now visible to the eye because we have a background color set, and the text color is white. So we have sufficient contrast between background and foreground here. You can see 300 units doesn't quite reach the edge of the phone for the 15 Pro Max. So if you want to see the exact dimensions for each iPhone and iPad and stuff like that, you can go into the human interface guidelines and find it. I will leave a link for that in the. I'll leave a link for the human interface guidelines itself, and the page for the device dimensions in the description. I urge you to read the human interface guidelines at least once a year, particularly after dub season, because they will change every year to accommodate for new operating system updates and stuff like that. So that's great and all that we have our background color and foreground color now, but let's change our constraints slightly. And we can go down into the very bottom of our file. And instead of our width anchor, we will say HWLabel.trailing anchor. Okay. Dot constraint. We can say equal to constant. All right, so the anchor that we want to pin this to is the view.trailing anchor. And then our constant here, as I mentioned in the programmatic UI video, trailing anchors must have a negative value. Let's for a second see what happens when we try to have a positive number here for this constraint. So we can save this. I see, because I don't have a comma here. That's why it failed here. There we go. Build succeeded. You can see our label goes to the edge of the screen, but it goes beyond the bounds. And that's because we have the constraint constant for the trailing anchor set to a positive 20. So it goes 20 units beyond the bounds of the phone, which we don't want. So go ahead and change that from 20 to negative 20. And now our label is more in line with what we expected. And that's great and all. That works. What if we want this view to be aligned at the bottom of our screen instead of the top? So, have the bottom anchor and have the bottom anchors of both the label and the bottom of the phone pinned to each other, rather than the top anchors being pinned together. Well, we can do this pretty simply. The first thing I want to show you, though, is what happens when we constrain this not to the safe area, but to the view's top anchor itself. All right. let's get rid of safe area layout guide. There we go. All right. So now we can save that and run our code. And now you can see our view is in fact, or rather our label is in fact there, but it's behind our notch. It's behind the notch, and we don't want it there. So that's why we have our safe area layout guide. All right. So we can replace that, and now we're back to normal. Let's go ahead and change this top anchor now to bottom anchor. So bottom anchor. There we go. So if we save this as is, and we try to run it, so here we are in our simulator. You can see that we have our label on screen, but our label is overlapping with the home indicator. And so why exactly did we do this? Well, that's because, or rather, why did this happen? Is a better question. The reason for this is because while we constrained the bottom anchor of our label to the safe area's bottom anchor, we also said that the constant needed to be 20. And so because we define this as a positive number and not a negative number, it's going beyond the safe area, which defeats the purpose of using the safe area layout guide. So let's go ahead and change this from a positive 20 to a negative 20. And we'll save that, run it again. And now our label is 20 units above the safe area on its bottom anchor. Right? You could get rid of the constant altogether and say that its bottom anchor is equivalent to the bottom anchor of the safe area, and then the bottom anchor will directly line up with the bottom anchor of the safe area. Right? You could do that if you wanted to, and that's perfectly acceptable. It just depends on the design of your app. Now there are certain exceptions to the rule of confine your app's content to the safe area. Primarily, the one exception that I can think of off the top of my head is with toolbars. You know how sometimes in some apps you have a toolbar down at the bottom of your screen for, in the Notes app example, composing a new note? Well, those toolbars are constrained to the very bottom of the view, so beyond the safe area. And that's and they're designed that way. That's the way it's supposed to be for those. Therefore, the toolbars on the bottoms are slightly larger, like slightly taller than 44 units to accommodate a button. So that's kind of one instance of an exception to the rule of constraining your views to the safe area. So that pretty much does it for this video, guys, on UILabel. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.